So we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming today. Appreciate you. We're going to start with a colleague in California who's unable to make it. She will be going first, and she's remote, and I will hand it over to her.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, I think you can see me. I've got a bird's eye view on the room from the back here. I'm Laura. I'm with the Surfrider Foundation, and I'm our policy manager out here in California. Very good to be with you today. Let me pull up my slides. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about a project that Surfrider really considers a poster child for how we can deal with the managed retreat of public infrastructure that is facing sea level rise vulnerabilities. So I'll talk a little bit about what I think some of the triggers were for this action and where we're at in the process. And with that, I'm going to start us in the belly of the whale of this story. With a bluff collapse in Del Mar, San Diego County in 2019. So this is sort of the scene in Del Mar. We have these beautiful 50 to 70 foot cliffs that stretch for a couple miles, but they run directly along the coast in Del Mar for about 2 miles. And anyone who's ridden this train, has thought about how close they are to the edge of the bluffs. That's been a reality for a very long time, and the bluffs have been eroding at about 1/2 foot per year for a very long time. And that rate, of course, is accelerating with sea level rise that is causing storm surge to undercut the toe of the bluffs. So this bluff collapse in 2019, if you check out the bottom right picture, that's what it looked like. This was a very dramatic moment because the bluff actually moved inward towards the track within 3 feet of the track. So this definitely made rail service unsafe. The rail had to close. But it also was just visually really dramatic. And, the bluffs here have been eroding and there have been collapses, and they're actually those collapses have been dealt with temporary measures by the manager of the rail for a very long time. And so there are sort of temporary seawalls and stormwater chutes flanking this 2 miles of cliffs. But this one was just a big deal because of the news it made and the visceral reaction that people had to what it would feel like to be so close to the rail. And again, this is a commuter line, so people take this line to work and they take it home, and it's also just a prioritized line for commerce and the military. So Surfrider gets really concerned, before 2019, but also in 2019, because the writing is on the wall for us. We deal a lot in San Diego with armoring of the bluffs that negatively impacts beaches and other coastal resources. And it's just very clear that the erosion threat flanking the train is not going to go away. And armoring is going to be a main part of the solution in the area. And the reason we're concerned is because Del Mar is an iconic kind of classic surf community in San Diego. There are tons of waves that are sandwiched in between 2 marine protected areas. So if you go surfing in a lot of places here, you're surfing with dolphins and with fish and with sharks too. There's also kind of cool, classic, historic coastal access in the form of goat trails all along the bluffs. Typically illegal, where people cross the rail line and walk down the bluffs, and armoring or contiguous armoring would obviously present a threat to that coastal access. And then finally, one that's really close to my heart is this is a walkable beach. It's part of the longest stretch of walkable beach in San Diego for a couple miles. I'm from the desert, and my parents would actually drive like 200 miles every summer just to walk this beach for a few days in a row. It's a really iconic scene with the reflection of the 70-foot bluffs reflecting onto the beach. And so Surfrider sees this bluff collapse. We see this talk about emergency armoring, and we start to worry what basically a giant seawall is going to look like in this area. We're not the only ones, of course, thinking about stabilization and planning. The real player that, my presentation is really to thank Sandag today. They're the manager of the rail in this area. And I think like a key takeaway from my presentation is their leadership is why we are seeing the relocation of this rail line. But Sandag, before 2019, at least to the public, very much appeared to be totally focused on stabilization. They were aware of that 1/2 foot per year erosion of the bluffs. They had been dealing with emergency bluff collapses for a while, and they had created a phased stabilization plan to, over time, more heavily armor the bluffs. They had assembled a working group of state and federal legislators, some really heavy hitters in that working group, to build support for a stabilization plan and to help chase after funding. And they had been studying relocation. I think that's important to acknowledge. But I would say, as an advocate working for Surfrider, which, we're a grassroots network of advocates, we tend to watchdog organizations like this in addition to collaborating with them. And talking to them about relocation at the time was really difficult. We were met with the same obstacles that many people in this room are probably thinking about right now, which is over and over again just being told that relocation was going to look like an insane price tag. I think at the time people told me $8 or $9 billion was the estimate to move this less than 2 mile section of track. And also, fears about picking a realignment alternative. Where's this rail going to go? Those were major obstacles. And relocation, while it was considered, it just wasn't, it didn't seem to be like the short-term future path. And then things really changed. And I have this slide just to illustrate what I think are some of the key ingredients to kind of, spurring a change in this kind of conversation. One is the bad spark, right? That 2019 bluff collapse was just visceral for so many people. And again, the writing was on the wall that there was going to be more and more work done in the area, and the community could see what it looked like. There were bobcats on the beach, meaning a lot of construction infrastructure on the beach affecting how people walked and enjoyed the beach. The bluffs kind of started to look really bad. Again, this is a visually iconic area, and the repair work, doesn't really look like the rest of the bluffs. And people just realized also, sea level rise obviously has become more of a reality in all of our lives over the last, I'd say, 10 years. And so I think that bad spark did lead to community engagement on this issue, and it gave Surfrider traction to talk about what we thought responsible sea level rise planning would look like in the area and what it would mean for this area. Something I really want to acknowledge is Sandag got new leadership that has just been really awesome to work with. The executive director, Hassan Akrada, is really known for kind of his vision with the rail line, and working with all different groups of people, including definitely with environmentalists. And then the Sandag board was really listening to the community about their concern for coastal resources in this area. And so all of these kind of changes combined to lead to our key milestone number one in this campaign, which is that Sandag committed formally and publicly to relocation of the rail line by 2035 in its regional transportation plan. So that's going to be another one of the key ingredients that I think is just absolutely necessary for a project like this, is the planning commitment. And I think one thing I want to acknowledge is those obstacles that I talked about before in the form of funding and the need for realignment. They were true, and they still are difficulties that the project will face. And yet Sandag still decided to make a planning commitment towards relocation. And I just think that that vision is really necessary. And the way that at Surfrider we talk about that commitment being justified in light of the obstacles is that it comes from a place that acknowledges the science-based vulnerabilities of the area, right? No matter how many obstacles are in the way, you can just look at this bluff and you can see that things are getting worse and they're not going to get better. And if you are going to prioritize coastal resources, at some point you're in between a rock and a hard place, and things have to move. And all of that is a colloquial way of saying all this. I will say, from a scientific perspective, this bluff region is one of the most studied formations in all of California due to its proximity to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So we do make these arguments from a more nuanced scientific perspective, but I just really respect Sandag for hearing out that this this vulnerability is clear and obvious, and despite obstacles, it's the plan and commitment that has to happen up front. So that was really great. This was in 2021 was when that regional transportation plan was finalized and we got that commitment towards relocation. But now we're in a situation where we're celebrating that commitment, but we still have a rail that needs to start running again, and it's very vulnerable. And that means some amount of armoring and bluff grading is going to happen, and we're going to need a phased adaptation plan that involves strategies in the short term that Surfrider would typically really not like, because they're going to have impacts to coastal resources. And so this is where I'd say, if the first key ingredient or key milestone in a campaign like that, this is a policy commitment towards relocation. I think the second is a phased adaptation plan that the community can trust is thoughtful and will actually lead towards managed retreat. So how do we think we achieved that on this project in California? Well, first of all, here in California, our regulator that permits development in the coastal zone is called the Coastal Commission. They do a pretty good job of ensuring that projects like these that have an impact on coastal resources do avoid and mitigate for impacts to impacts to waves and beaches and bluffs. However, at a certain point, if you're going to put up a mile-long contiguous seawall, there's not really an amount of sand that you can add in front of the toe of a bluff that's meeting with the ocean that will build back this beach, right? And the Coastal Commission tries to ensure in-kind mitigation. You can have all the trails in the world to this beach, but if there's no beach anymore, we've definitely lost something serious, right? And so, to the commission's credit and to Sandag's credit, I think the thought for building out this permit was how do we actually keep the beach in the future? And the compromise that we came up with, or that those two entities came up with, that Surfrider supported, was almost a mile long seawall, and that has yet to be built, but it's in the works. And this is something Surfrider ultimately supported, which, a mile-long seawall, would typically sound like Surfrider's worst nightmare, I'd say. But what we supported about this project was that there was a genuine compromise towards keeping the beach in this area that we trusted, and that came out of the special conditions that the Coastal Commission applied to the project permit. And these are these colored boxes that I think are really necessary for a phased adaptation project that you can trust. The first is the armoring was both designed and permitted to be temporary. And I just really want to emphasize temporary seawall. Surfrider heard that word, or those two words, and we had a lot of distrust. Like, what is a temporary seawall? Because a lot of the bread and butter of our work is fighting armoring that takes advantage of loopholes that allow seawalls to last far beyond their intended lifetime, and that means that they continue to have negative impacts to public resources throughout all that time. But in this case, the seawalls that Sandag designed, instead of looking like concrete that's sprayed onto bluffs, they're more like wooden walls that are slid into slats. And so I think the design really showed us that from the bottom up, this project was meant to be temporary. And the Coastal Commission also doubled down on that promise by only authorizing their permit for the next 30 years. So you might notice there's some extension of the timeline. So basically Sandag committed to relocating the rail line by 2035, but the seawalls are permitted till 2050. But I think, we understood the need for some buffer time there, since so much money and energy is going to be needed to make this realignment project actually happen. The second thing that was committed to that I think built a lot of trust in this project was part of the permit, part of the mitigation components of the permit required Sandag, the rail manager, to basically design and fund coastal access routes across the railway. So access points across railroads are very expensive because they have to meet certain state criteria. They're obviously more expensive than maintaining those illegal goat trails that a lot of people are using. And so I think it was a win for this community to know, like, hey, this project isn't going to totally block off coastal access for miles, and that coastal access is going to get funded and managed by the people who would ultimately have to fund and manage it anyway. And now it's happening in this permit. So that was a really big commitment that was important to build trust. And then I think the third piece that was important was that Sandag will also have to apply to remove the shoreline armoring and basically get rid of the rail that's sitting on the coast once they do achieve relocation. Because that's actually a conversation we're having more and more, is we're seeing entities become more interested in the retreat of public infrastructure, but they're not thinking about actually removing the old, more coastal facing infrastructure. And that means it will just continue to sit there and cause erosion and negative impact. So we appreciated that this removal of shoreline armoring was also built into the permit. So coming towards the end here, I was talking with Sandag staff about what they thought, other rail managers or just other big jurisdictions might need as a recipe for actually committing to relocation, like what makes a project like this realistic. And these are the 4 tactics that we came up with. The planning commitment, which again, I just can't stress enough, like that can happen side by side with other more current, immediate, urgent efforts. A realignment study, people do need a picture of where this infrastructure might get relocated to. Again, I will emphasize that doesn't need to be done. Doing something like relocating a rail line is going to have big impacts on communities. And so there's going to be lots of follow-up studies, but doing preliminary studies to show that this is a real consideration, I think, is important. And then, of course, funding. And all these first 3 are in gray because I think the San Diego project has mostly pursued them. Funding, this is, the price tag for this is now estimated more like $3 to $4 billion for relocation. That's still a lot of money. And this is where I'd like to just thank a lot of state and federal leaders for pursuing funding for this. And Stefanie will probably talk about it more in her presentation, but we do think there's a lot of sources for this kind of funding, and it's going to happen in pieces. So I just like to encourage entities to focus on trying to get bits and pieces early and often. And then the last piece is more in the hands of the rail manager or the jurisdiction is engineering and design. They have to be willing to go through environmental engineering and permitting, and that's obviously a big expensive project too. And that's, again, where I think the vision of Sandag comes into play. And I would say, I guess, like Surfrider's role in all of these is to encourage them to happen on a certain timeline and to help communicate to the public some of the trade-offs. So with Surfrider, we tend to be a voice in San Diego that is trusted around responsible sea level rise planning. And so we can help people understand some of the compromises of a phased adaptation plan. And I think people respect that. We'll approach that with a certain level of scrutiny. And so my takeaways for the relocation or retreat of critical infrastructure with a phased adaptation plan is one that compromise is key. Surfrider, like many other grassroots groups, we have our own goals to protecting coastal resources. And we understand that, in the case of like a coastal railway, safety is going to be the top concern of the rail manager. There's going to be some compromises that are needed across both of us. But I think in order to achieve compromise, trust is just totally critical. Again, there's a lot of people we work with, a lot of volunteers in the communities that just don't have trust that, their local government is prioritizing their considerations, and building that trust. It takes a lot of work. Like Sandag met for over a year with local community members who were angry, both virtually and in person. They produced designs that were a compromise on structural engineering goals that probably would have otherwise been more robust if this project was genuinely designed to last longer. And so they did a really creative thing in their design. They worked with us at every level of the Coastal Commission permitting for this project. So I would say trust is necessary for that compromise. It is also possible when there's like genuine effort to meet the needs of the community. And then finally, everybody plays a role. There are just so many people that I think will ultimately have to think on this project. And some of them are, you know, again, SANDAG for their vision, federal leaders like Representative Mike Levin for securing funding for this project, our Senate Pro Tem in California for finding funding and making the need urgent for people. Local leadership in Del Mar, the mayors, the different mayors that have had to deal with this in Del Mar to really you know, help the community understand the long-term nature and benefits of a project like this. And then I think Surfrider as a grassroots group does a lot to, you know, make some of this palatable. Infrastructure, these complicated rail projects are not the easiest for the average community member to digest. And a lot of times community members' goals are pretty simple. We want to keep our waves, we want to keep our beaches, we want to walk the beach with my family, whatever it is. And so I think there is a really big role for advocates to play to make this digestible and also like build that trust in a compromise solution. And that is the presentation, and I hope the rest go awesome. I'll be tuning in and happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Hello, I'm Stefanie Sekich. I am the Senior Manager for Surfrider's Coast and Climate Initiative. And I get the privilege of working with our chapters all over the country and in Puerto Rico. We have about 180 chapters, and then we have affiliates in Europe as well. So Laura and I really had to go in tandem here. First of all, I don't surf. I'm like the token dork, like, so don't feel like you have to surf to pay attention to this. But we really had to kind of go in tandem because what's happened in San Diego is going to inform what's going to happen in Orange County. And before we get to the actual meat of this presentation, I wanted to take a little historical road trip. Oh, this is our mission statement for everyone. So the 7 miles that we're going to talk about and see pictures of are literally some of the most beautiful, iconic places in the world, for that matter. And they are seriously in jeopardy. Where Laura was talking was 2 miles of jeopardy. This is 7 miles of jeopardy. Her 2 miles of jeopardy were on an actual bluff. These 7 miles are literally on the ground next to the ocean. So just to kind of give you a visual. So let's go way, way back to the Civil War. President Lincoln passed the Pacific Railroad Act to literally unite our country. And his quote was, I have to read it so I get it right. May God unite this country as this railroad will unite 2 of the greatest oceans in the world. So it was really, really, again, the thrust was to bring people together, get over what was happening with the Civil War and get jobs. You kind of all kind of see what this was. And especially when we go back to like 6th grade and we learned about the Transcontinental Railroad and what that looked like and the Golden Spike and all the different plays into it, we'll dive a little bit deeper to show how Southern California became what it is. So this is the Golden Spike. This is when it was the first spike that was about ready to go into California, and they came together, literally had a Golden Spike, drove it in there, and then was able to start the connection of the Transcontinental Railroad. As that happened, though, they were bidding, different cities were bidding, how and where is this railroad going to end up? So it was a really kind of a fight between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And Los Angeles definitely didn't win the battle on that. So the corridor at that point was supposed to go to Sacramento, even though it wasn't the Pacific, right? Because that was the whole intention, right? It's called the Pacific Railroad. So it made its way to Sacramento, which is about 60 miles away from the coast. And then they did the leg thereafter. So, but what that did is it completely blocked off Southern California, completely closed them off from any kind of transit or actually connection with the real world for that matter. This is the stop in Los Angeles when it finally came to fruition. So now that we kind of got like the transcontinental perspective, now we're going to dive into Southern California. So this is the Lawson corridor where Laura was starting in San Diego. It's the second busiest corridor in the nation, next to where you all do your commuting here in the Northeast. As I said, Los Angeles was chomping at the bit to get some rails because they felt left out and they wanted to do that. So they hustled really hard to get funds so that in about 1880, they were able to kind of break ground and get that going. And started in San Diego, though. I have to be very clear on that. Los Angeles was like, let's just get this whole thing tied up. And so there's other railroad ownership, which we don't need to get into, but I'm really fascinated by railroads now, and I never thought I would be. So the whole corridor itself is 350 miles. And as Laura said, it's a pretty big commuter corridor itself. There's multiple trains, not just the Amtrak that's there. There's the Metrolink, there's the coaster, there's millions of people that use this on an annual basis, and commuters as well. So we're going to focus on kind of where Laura started with like the end of the 60 miles and go up to Orange County. This corridor is special for many reasons, not just because of the natural beauty. It crosses 6 lagoons. So again, we're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have built there. I don't know. We can't go back and shake our fingers at, land developers from 150 years ago, but like, the writing's on the wall so much is like, we just built in really lame places for about 200 years and it's coming back to bite us. So not only does it go through these beautiful lagoons, but it goes through Camp Pendleton. And Camp Pendleton is the largest military base on the West Coast. They have, if you can see this area here, so like hello, Southern California developed. And then this is the base right here. It's huge. It's over 125 square miles, 125,000 square miles. I mean, it goes back into the watershed. They do a lot of land stewardship. And again, the juxtaposition between the development and non-development is critical. And just to bring it to here, as Laura was talking about, Surfrider definitely does not like armoring because it interferes with our sand cycle. So I'm going to do just a quick geology lesson here. So on the West Coast, I should really make this clear, is that most of our sand comes from inland areas. It comes from our watersheds and our bluffs. And so if there's something that's in front of it, whether it be a dam or like as Laura was mentioning, coastal armoring, it literally traps the sand behind these structures. And then you have wave action coming and just chipping at the front of that to the point where there's absolutely no beach. So you can see this is an amazing lagoon. Look at all that sand. We'll zoom in, but again, the juxtaposition between lack of beach with these hard structures. So again, we won't need to go through all of this. I don't want to waste too much time, but the critical point of all of this, especially for coastal planning, is a sediment budget. It's like your budget at your home, right? You know how much money is coming in, you know how much money is going out. And if I could just give recommendations for all landowners, it's to get a sediment budget down to some extent to figure out like, how can we get more sand into this cycle? So I really could go on forever about geology because I love it more than rails, but this is just another kind of visual implication of what seawalls can look like and how your beach it says gradual loss, but in some places it can be a really quick loss of the beach. There was a new study that came out that said by 2100, about 70% of our beaches in California will erode. I kind of take umbrage with some of those statistics, but I do believe it for Southern California. We have armored about 14% of our entire state, but in Southern California, we have about 40% of our coastlines that have, again, seawalls, riprap, anything like that. So we're already starving our beaches in Southern California. And the big 900-pound gorilla in the room. We are starting to see, sorry about some of the font, it got switched when I went to Google. So, I mean, as we can see, different parts of the country and the world have experienced different levels of sea level rise. And categorically, it's anywhere between 6 to 8 at the global scale. In the Northeast, it can be up to 12 inches. Galveston, Texas right now has experienced 18 inches of sea level rise in the past 100 years. But the graph does not lie. We are being inundated. So here's our lay of the land. Here's the 7 miles. I'm going to focus on the 2 areas with stars. And again, you kind of just get the, oh, watershed, undeveloped. Now, here you go. So this is the most precarious part of the train track. And it's by a very exclusive private community, gated community. No one can access the beach there, even if we did have sand, but there's no sand whatsoever. And then we'll zoom in to the ground level. This was just taken recently. So in the past 3 years, and again, I'm not a chemist, but if you have salt on iron or like corrosion, like kind of scary for us. So this part of the rail has been closed 4 times in the past 3 years. Del Mar was like closed way less than this. And again, it's because the rail is literally on the ground next to the ocean. So it will be closed for 5 or 6 months at a time and then reopen. They also closed a segment that they have not opened back up, where they're providing alternative transportation with a bus, but they're only doing that with Amtrak. They're not doing that with the Metrolink. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So now I'm just going to show you pretty pictures or not, based on what's happening. So yeah, it's yeah, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This was actually taken by the Orange County Transportation Authority, which is we call the OCTA, and they're the rail manager themselves. And I want to stress in the most politically politely way that I can, this is behind the orange curtain, right? So San Diego is very different than Orange County in terms of like their land development, in terms of their politics, in terms of their progressiveness. And so I think that's really important to keep in the back of everyone's mind here. It's also much smaller than San Diego. So San Diego is more of a metropolitan area where there's a lot of diversity of not just people, but ideas. So I think that's important to keep in the back of your head. So as you can see, I mean, there's sand that's getting onto the tracks, that's just constant maintenance of this line that's in precarious. And as you can see, there's literally no beach because the wave action has just completely undercut it. So now you can see, so this is striking to me because you can see the part where it's the chokehold, right? Where it's constantly falling. And then you can see how much rocks they put. And again, there's no beach, right? And then we go down here and there's beach. So that's what Laura was getting at is, you know, we literally have nightmares when we hear seawalls, you know, armoring, because it's so empirically obvious what happens. But in certain places with these critical infrastructures, this is a Band-Aid approach. And obviously we're all here to talk about the long-term approach, which is relocation. This is them just pouring more rock. So now I'm going to take you up to San Juan Capistrano. And this is the railroad right here. Actually, I had like a little laser. You can see the rail right here. And the road, that's the PCH. That is like world renowned. This area typically had a pretty broad beach, you can see. So you can see next to the little, it's like a beach club. There's like a pretty good amount of sand. And then in front of the beach club, there's not a lot of sand because they put a seawall. The thing that's really important about, so this is the same place, same location. This area is a natural ancient landslide. So, but when they were trying to look at this, they called it the impossible railroad because they know geologically it's completely unstable. So when I say an ancient landslide, literally millennia ago, this area of the coastline was constantly sliding and sloughing and having scarp everywhere. So again, something important to keep in the back of your head. So then we started getting south swells as climate change is more and more pronounced. And even though I'm not a surfer, I understand waves way more than I thought I ever would. And we get these, you know, south swells are like a normal occurrence in the ocean. You just kind of, in the summertime, they get a little more intense and then they make their way up the coast and surfers have great waves. But those waves are also now taking away the beach. And so literally within 3 years, this entire part of the beach has been gone. And the next pictures are just gobsmacking to me, and having spent a lot of time at this beach, to see it go so quickly. And for someone who believes in climate change and sea level rise, it honestly scared the bejesus out of me because we're not like the East Coast. You all are like, you have subsidence, right? So you like just geologically, your coasts are kind of like just stable and sinking. And the West Coast is not going to get as much sea level rise as the East Coast. I mean, that's been apparent and it's proven. But to see that happen, that's why I was so frightened, is because we never thought that we would see this incremental sea level rise coupled with the tumultuous seas because of climate change, absorbing so much heat and just becoming a tumultuous sea. So here we go. Now now the parking lot's there. Oh wait, let's go back real quick. So as you can see, this basketball court eventually fell into the ocean. So this is them trying to save it and put armoring on there. And we were like, are you serious? You're literally trying to save a basketball court? Who doesn't understand geology? Take it out so you get the sand to move around and stop it. And it took them years to wrap their head around that. So again, it's kind of the climate maybe in this community where the long-term thinking is definitely lacking. So here we go. This is right after there's the basketball court and the palm trees. The locals were flipping out about the palm trees. Like they were like more sad about that. I'm like, again, like, can we all just do some geology here? Then they took it out. So this is what it looks like after they removed it. This beach house is also gone. So it was like bathrooms, there was concessions. All of the infrastructure that's there was either taken by the ocean or taken by the Orange County Public Works. Here it is after they put in, I know it's such a nasty picture, and I'm not like trying to show my own image up here, but after they took everything down, they put these geotextile bags down. My friends from Hawaii call them beach burritos, and they're made of plastic. And again, we have these south swells, and then they just started like, this is all rebar right here. This is all iron. This is underneath, which has fallen out. So this is literally like the most unsafe beach that you can ever imagine. I mean, it looks like a wasteland. It's heartbreaking to me. But we're moving along. But again, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the equity issues. So in California, our Constitution has the right for the access to navigable waters. So there's just by our state constitution, there is a lack of beach access, which is an equity issue for us. As Laura was saying, a lot of this is public safety as well. So it's not just surfers going down there, but it's a sense of safety. And then again, the Metrolink was closed. There were no alternatives. And the Amtrak is more, I would say, in terms of demographics, more touristy, more white, more professionals, higher income. And the Metrolink is not that. So you can put two and two together to see that there was a lot of people who had to find alternative ways to work that I'm sure probably couldn't afford it. And I was like in the shower the other day thinking, I'm like, I wonder how many people like either had to quit their job or like take a lift, or like it just thousands and thousands and thousands of non-white high middle class tourists have been gravely impacted. And obviously there's economics. I mean, the less like anybody who's a surfer goes and you buy surf wax, you buy, sunscreen. And so you are putting money into that community. It has a multiplying effect. But when our beaches are closed and the rails are closed, obviously there's economics. So what can we do? Well, let's move it. So we partnered up with a group called Relocate. You should look at them if you want to like really nerd out. These are like nerd to the core train aficionados. Like half the knowledge I just gave you from the beginning was from these gentlemen. And they have been advocating for a long time to move this inland through a tunnel. So it would go under I-5 and it would be roughly 14 miles where they're skirting it away from the coast. We support this. We are very happy our friends came up with this proposal to do the tunneling underneath it. And the Lawson group, which again is part of OCTA, Amtrak, Metrolink, the conglomeration, they did study, and I use that word very loosely, what they could possibly do to help the railroad in 2003. So this is 20 years ago, y'all, and nothing has happened. This is the last time. Meanwhile, we're having trains and railroad tracks falling into the ocean. So they kind of get close to it with this longer one, with a split. And then this is just a short one. So they have looked at it, but they just wrote it on the map. They didn't really do any engineering study, really very lackluster, we'll just say that. So towards the end here of the presentation, I just have to be honest, we are working with them because we, as Laura said, we are advocates. Our job is to politely push agencies to do the right thing, make sure that we're keeping our community safe at the same time. So this slide really reflects, so they're doing great. They're conducting sea level rise analysis. I work in Florida all the time and North Carolina, and their legislator actually put something where you couldn't even use the word climate change. So the fact that in California, we're looking at climate change, great. Some, sea level rise, good. I'm happy about that. They are doing stakeholder involvement, kind of because we are really there like every day. And they say that they're going to do this as well. So that's good. But then we start to get to the timeframes and it's just negative. I mean, a lot of what they have here, and this was presented a month ago, this right here, their next steps. They're going to take 2 years to do a literature review. I'm like, I don't understand why 24 months or 20 months is going to be extrapolating data that's already there. Like, this is a bad geologic area, like sea levels are rising. I just feel like that 2 years should be used to actually do more substantive research on relocating it. I have to be honest, there's some people in the staff and some people on the board that understand the importance of this. But I would say the majority of them are not looking forward to relocation. In fact, one gentleman literally told me last week when we were meeting, this railroad will not be moved in my lifetime. And our goal is by 2035, just like Sandag and Laura was talking about. So again, their interim is just to keep it stable, just to keep it in place for the next 10 years, just keep putting those rocks down. And then again, their midterm, which is like 10 to 30 years out, really has nothing in it as well. It's just to hold it in place. And then they say, we'll look at alternative concepts, ACs. Well, that means relocation. They won't even put it in planning documents, like alternative concepts. So we're definitely, as you can see, not into their time frame. We wish that they would speed it up. So really good stuff on now the positive kind of shift. So because there's a huge military base, there's a huge federal nexus, and Congressman Levin is on it. He helped with Sandag, he helped get the funding there. He's been very vocal. And again, that community falls on deaf ears when you speak to that community about relocation. And then the two pieces of legislation that were passed, I will dork out with you here for 2 seconds, but I'm not gonna there's a lot of words and letters and numbers on the next slide. But I'm highlighting it because we're all of us are working in our communities, and there's planners here and there's governments here to get our hands on the money. So myself and a colleague, we have, oh my God, painstakingly gone through the BIL and the IRA to come up with totaling numbers that work for us. So there's $6 billion for coastal restoration, which means living shorelines, whatever to make it look or to make our coastline resilient. And then there's 177 billion within these two bills for the Department of Transportation. So again, I'm not going to go through this. If you want this slide, if you want my database, we're making a database that we can actually do a toolkit that shows what this means. There's different kind of projects that go through different agencies and grants. And the BIL is very clear, usually goes to a federal agency, then a state agency, municipalities. The IRA bill is a little less focused. So that's why we're pulling out what we believe applies to all of our work. So you can see we highlighted anything with sea level rise or national safety. I mean, I feel like we probably want safe highways that will help local. So again, all of these grants can be applied to what we're talking about. Last thing, when we were talking with the staff the other day, they tried to say, and again, there's some really good folks in there. I don't want to paint the picture as gloom, but there's no money for this. And I'm like, oh, there is, and we hear that all of the time, as Laura said, there's no money, it's going to be so expensive. And when Sandag was going through this, these bills weren't out there. So it's the cop out, and it's a constant cop out of we can't do it for both design and capital improvements. And I think that's what I'm really trying to squash when I talk to these agencies is you can get a bunch of money to do your design and make it really substantive, and then you're going to get monies to do the capital improvements. And they just feel like those things are mutually exclusive. Again, equity, climate friendly, again, we don't need to go through all of them, just again, showing you how much money is out there. So lessons learned from San Diego. Our car culture is stymieing. I mean, because we got left out when the Transcontinental Railroad didn't come down to us, we just, here's your cul-de-sac, here's your car, here's post-World War II, go out and build, suburbia. And so that's definitely been stymieing. And having really key, as Laura said, mentioned congressional representatives and help. And it's funny because Laura and I didn't actually go over all the lessons learned before we did the final thing, but yes, we're on the same page. I think having community and advocates outside of those local communities is super key because again, there's 7 million people that ride that railroad where there's one community with 100 people. So it's a sense of equity again, and having these voices that can counter NIMBYism. I hate to say it. It's too expensive to relocate. No, it's not, because the continual maintenance of this is going to be super pricey, guarantee it. And again, the cop out, I'm always going to say this, we can't get funds for both design and capital improvements. Time is way more of the essence in Orange County because it's 3 times the amount of rail that's in harm's way. They're behind already in terms of studying this. The OCTA compared to Sandag. Sandag, as Laura said, had been looking at it, had been talking about it. So we're already like 10 milestones behind. I think that these emergencies, and Dolan's here, he's with Hawaii Sea Grant, these constant emergencies hopefully are going to push these paradigm shifts, like catastrophe. So yay, when there's closures, I mean, it sounds so ironic because it's just pushing people to go, this is a real problem. And then media exposure, which again, Laura put in there, which we didn't talk about, I think is key because it really gives people this visceral reaction. And lastly, we are going to continue to advocate and be the voice out there to match their sister organization in Sandag to move by 2035. We're going to continue meeting with the OCTA. We actually have good relationships with them in there, even though we might not agree. And I think that's really important, is to have these relationships and understand, as Laura was saying, compromise is key. We're building a toolkit, as I mentioned, so you can find me on the interwebs. And it really spells out like how these funds can go to what we're talking about. Continue with the public education. We need to grow our coalition. Right now, it's like nerdy surfers and nerdy train enthusiasts. And then just continuing to work with Congress and moving the needle with all the federal agencies that are involved in helping getting those monies to the local level. So that's it for me.
All right. Thank you. That was awesome. Such great photos in there. It's really exciting. My name is Mary Kimball. I'm the Urban and Community Resilience Team Lead at Arcadis, and I'm standing in here today for Josh DeFlorio, who's the Chief of Resilience and Sustainability at the Port Authority. We're going to be switching gears a little bit. We're going to move to the East Coast, and I'm actually not talking too much about managed retreat today, but really on the concept of infrastructure interdependencies. So Arcadis has been working with the Port Authority since the beginning of the climate risk assessment program that began a few years ago. Sorry, forward. Okay. A little bit of background for those of you maybe not from the New York City area about the Port Authority, or maybe also for New Yorkers who maybe don't know that it's actually more than just that terrible bus terminal. It's actually, I don't work for the Port Authority, so I can say that. Actually includes a wide range of different facilities across both New York and New Jersey. It's a bi-state authority that was created in 1921. It covers 4 different modes of transportation, as well as some real estate assets. And the district, kind of a fun fact, the Port District is defined as 25 miles from the Statue of Liberty. And I'm really going to be focusing today on the climate risk assessment program, but it's really part of a broader effort underway at the Port Authority really since Hurricane Sandy to assess and mitigate climate risk. It includes $2.1 billion that the Port Authority has implemented on Sandy recovery and hardening projects. A lot of that is focused on coastal flooding and those assets impacted by Sandy. But starting in 2021 with Hurricane Ida, there's been a lot more focus on intense precipitation. And there's also been an emerging focus across the authority on heat impacts as well. So the purpose of the climate risk assessment is to really think more proactively and looking long term to address a range of future climate hazards, coastal rain and heat, and really looking across all the Port Authority facilities and all of the Port Authority's individual assets, including things directly owned by the Port Authorities, but also things that are owned by their tenants, as well as sort of things that are owned by external utilities or others that those facilities depend upon. And the goal here is really to quantify the importance of those assets and then identify feasible and cost-effective mitigation measures. And all of this will feed into the Port Authority's capital planning process and inform the development of specific capital projects. And I'm sure they'll be going after some of those grants that you were just mentioning too. And Arcadis is supporting, really across the program on the program management side. We're developing program guidance and then putting this guidance out into the program. There's then other engineering consultant teams who are using that guidance to do facility consultations and direct engagement with individual facilities. And then our role is sort of taking all of that data in and creating a comprehensive risk assessment. So at a high level, the program includes 3 primary technical tasks. There's data collection, which is identifying critical assets and also assessing the consequences of impacts to those assets. And that's informed by desktop analysis, as well as site visits to individual facilities, an interview with the facility operators. The second part is on climate risk modeling and really looking specifically at each site, developing hazard modeling to identify the probability of a range of different climate impacts. And then third, on mitigation, identifying mitigation concepts and evaluating those different concepts based off of what is the most cost-effective and provides the most benefits. And then the outputs from this process is the identification of these priority mitigation measures that are then integrated into the decision-making of the Port Authority. Capital planning, as I mentioned, but also things like decisions around insurance and risk management and business planning and other types of reporting and disclosures that they do too. And this is envisioned as an ongoing cycle that aligns with the Port Authority's capital planning cycle that happens every 10 years. And a key element to the program identified here with this little computery looking icon is the digital assessment platform, or the DAP, that Arcadis is also responsible for developing and managing. The DAP really sort of plays a critical process across this workflow. It takes in information from assets on their criticality and the consequences, information from the risk modeling, and then provides information that can then be used by the consultants to identify mitigation concepts, and then also evaluates the benefits of those mitigation concepts and develops that benefit cost analysis. So really the importance of the DAP is really taking complex data on assets, hazards, and mitigations, and then developing these optimized climate risk reduction plans. So on the asset side, taking in information on the location and elevation of assets, as well as data on sort of the replacement costs, as well as information at the facility scale on revenue and economic losses. Like if the facility can't operate, what does that impact have on the regional economy or on the Port Authority's revenue too? An important element too is that it takes in information, and we'll go into this in more detail, on system hierarchies and really how assets are connected to each other, and how they work as a system to support the Port Authority's operations. It also then takes in inputs from the hazard modeling. We can actually assign a probability of loss to every asset, and this enables us to identify vulnerable critical assets, and then also quantify risk at an asset level. And then this information used to develop mitigation concepts and information specific to the mitigation on which assets are protected, what the cost of mitigations and what the timeline of the mitigation is then incorporated into the DAP in order for us to develop, really optimized combination of mitigation actions. And the benefit of this being a digital tool and not just us, at our computers in Excel is really that we can look at a lot of different types or a lot of different variations in what these different mitigation options are. And we can optimize also based off of different parameters. We can look at different discount rates. We can look at, different types of consequences. We can even look at, different kind of risk tolerances and look at different sea level rise scenarios. So a little bit more about this, about the DAP itself. Really, the value is in looking at these cascading impacts and really trying to understand, what are the consequences at the facility scale of individual assets based off of how they're connected to each other. So a little example here, this is a fictional port facility. We've got a container crane that takes the boxes off and on the ship or the vessel, not a marine person, sorry. It's powered by a transformer, which is powered by a substation, which is getting power from a substation that's actually owned by utilities, so off of the facility site. And so we can see in this example, there's direct impacts from a flood for the container crane as well as to the transformer, so that those assets are out. But we also need to be thinking more broadly about, sort of other elements of that network that could be out. So if we're there, for instance, if there's another higher flood at a higher surge elevation, we may also have impacts to that substation that's actually out of the Port Authority's facility. But if it goes down, it takes down the substation, which then also takes down the transformer and the crane. And there could be, other assets at the facility that also rely on the substation that would also be impacted. So you can imagine, that's a simple example. You can imagine at the scale of something like, like Newark Airport or LaGuardia or JFK, this gets very complicated very quickly. And this graphic here is kind of what this looks like within the DAP program itself, where we have numerous assets that are connected to each other throughout this network. And basically what the DAP can do is it can compute, really what are the operational impacts of individual assets being damaged that really kind of take into account the role of that asset within this complicated network. So we can look at not just the costs of replacement and physical damage to individual assets, but really what that means in terms of broader regional economic losses and revenue losses, which are, really in the end, what a lot of the Port Authority facilities provide to the region. So how do we do that? The first step is to develop this very simple diagram called a functional hierarchy diagram, which starts with first identifying for each facility really what is the critical mission of the facility. This is an example from a bridge facility. So really the mission here is the safe transportation of people and goods. And then within that mission, we identify different essential functions that are key to performing that mission. And we also identify these KPIs or key performance indicators, which are really just metrics that measure the ability of the facility to perform those functions and reach that mission. And then we divide up the facility into individual systems within each essential function, and then each within that subsystems. You can see examples here, and then each individual asset is part of those subsystems. So then once we kind of have that overall system and understanding of that map and how all these different assets are connected to each other, we then really sort of dive into more detail and define those specific relationships between individual assets. And the terminology that we've come up from the program is these sort of familiar relationships. We identify child assets, and these are those things like that container crane that are really the ones performing the essential function. And then things like the transformer or the substation, those are the parent assets whose role is really just to enable the functioning of the child, and that's about it. And I don't have children, but maybe that resonates with anyone who does. And so the child is then in the system identified as the connection to those essential functions and to those KPIs. So creating these networks allow us to model how impacts impact throughout that network. So if one parent asset is impacted by a flood or heat event, the child can't perform its essential function, and there's a loss to that KPI. So in other words, the substation is out, the crane can't operate, the port can't move goods, and every day that the crane is out, there's some sort of loss of economic output that we can measure. The network also allows us to model redundancy. So for instance, if there's a generator that can power the crane if the substation is out, we can incorporate that into the network. And we can show that if the substation go down, the generator can still power that crane, goods can still move, and KPIs for economic output are still met. However, if both the substation and the generator are down, both parents are out, the child cannot get any power, the crane can't work, and then the KPI is impacted. So then, we create this large network, and then based off of the hazard modeling, we assign probabilities of direct damage to each of those assets. So that's the probability of that asset being directly flooded or directly impacted by a heat event. And then we also assign a probability of indirect impact, which is sort of the probability that is propagated throughout that network, sort of the probability of all the upstream assets that that asset depends upon. And basically, in essence, what this allows us to do is kind of identify, what are those weakest links in the network? What are the things that are most vulnerable, but also if they're out, have like the broader systemic impacts across the facility that impact revenue generation or economic activity. So it's my last slide. I'll be the first to say we're still in the process of fully building out this step, and we have not figured everything out. I know Josh would say that too, but we are getting close, and we are figuring it out, and we have a good game plan for getting there. And really just, there are not a lot of established methodologies to really pull on in this space that really get at that challenge of systems level risk assessment and the challenge of how to quantify those interdependencies. And Josh did want me to say that, the Port Authority will be continuing to give updates at forums like this and to, groups like this to really continue to build out that literature and that understanding of how to do this and to help others who are, tackling similar problems. Also, I think this program really shows the benefit of having these digital tools to manage complex systems, but it is only as good as the data that we put into it. And so it's really important to be doing these on the ground engineering consultations and getting the information right in terms of how all these assets are connected to each other, and trying to have the most accurate outputs that we can. Because in the end of the day, the Port Authority is going to be taking these outputs from this program and using it to make decisions about how to spend limited resources. So, we want to get it as close to right as we can. And it's certainly a lot of responsibility, but it's also very exciting to be working on something that's really has a direct connection to implementation and to decision making. So my contact info as well as Josh's, and feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you.
My name is Allie Reilly. I work for WSP on our climate resilience team, and we work with agencies across the country, largely in the transportation space, to plan for climate risk. So I think following the other presentations, we've got some like direct risk concerns, some kind of community concerns, and I think this will kind of take a different vantage point around how we're thinking about transportation investments and climate migration in what we can call receiving communities. And also my colleague, Catherine Prince, I think is joining in online, but a lot of this project was her ideation. So I just want to thank her for that. There we go. So just a quick agenda. So I'm going to kind of provide some context around climate migration, climate gentrification, and equity, and kind of just planning in the US. And then walk through a case study of work that we did in Jackson Street, which is based in Escambia County, Florida. So I'll provide some background on our methodology, project context, and give you a sense of what we did there and kind of reflect on what that means for the field. So I kind of just want to stop and provide background on two kind of key points that are essential to the work that we did. So one, I'll talk through gentrification and how climate change is playing a role. I'm assuming this is a crowd that's heard of climate gentrification before, has an understanding of what that means. So I'm not going to belabor the point, but also just think about kind of the legacy of urban planning in the US. So we know as our role as planners, particularly transportation planners, there are a lot of kind of histories of transportation investments causing displacement and having subpar outcomes, to say the least. So first, just a quick primer on climate gentrification. So gentrification is a process of change within historically disinvested communities based on kind of influx of new residents moving in, real estate investments and the like, which can lead to rises in property value, rents, making it untenable for folks who currently live there to continue to live there, and then also this change in community character piece. So the argument, climate gentrification is a term that was coined by Jesse Keenan and collaborators in a 2018 paper, is that climate change will play a role in gentrification. It will exacerbate these things, making certain properties more valuable because they're a lower risk, and then potentially increasing the likelihood that folks will move there and raising property value costs and making it untenable for folks to live there. So I'm going to come back to that in a bit. So just to frame kind of that other part that I was talking about around kind of the legacy of planning in the US, one of the things that we're challenging ourselves to do as planners today is to understand kind of ways in which past planning processes and future risks of climate change can be kind of reconciled in current projects and making sure that we aren't making the same mistakes. Knowing that this can potentially be an international audience, just some background on, some work that my colleague Catherine actually did that kind of exemplifies this kind of past planning implications. So this is an example of Overtown in Miami, where there is a large African-American population in Overtown. It was a very, culturally rich community. And then in the 1960s, I-95 was built through this town, leading to, mass displacement of over 40,000 people. And today, Overtown is one of Miami-Dade County's poorest communities. And then to highlight some work that, again, my colleague did around Overtown was thinking about what does that mean today? So for some work we did for Miami-Dade County, we found that Overtown has the highest number of crashes in Miami-Dade County. So it is the highest crash rate in the geographic area, the highest number of low-income households, the highest number of households with 0 cars, and it's a predominantly African-American and Hispanic community. And so come back to this piece of kind of how do we think about that in light of climate migration, things that are changing, and how we plan for the future. And so climate gentrification is kind of one of these places where we want to think about this, right? So we're seeing climate gentrification happen in Florida, particularly. I'd love to hear if folks are seeing it in other parts of the US or world where they're living and seeing kind of what that means. But this specific example is in Miami, where we're seeing more wealthy residents leaving the coast to higher elevation areas. And as a result, folks who live in this community, Liberty City, are being priced out. So I think the key stat here is that a cost of a single family home has tripled in the past decade. And so thinking about kind of these two pieces that I just walked through, I'll present some work that we did in the Jackson Street corridor in Escambia County, where we worked with the city, the county, and the redevelopment agency. So the project was not a climate adaptation or resilience project. The project's goal was to develop a master plan for the corridor. And so we worked with, as I mentioned, those 3 jurisdictions and helped to develop a master plan for the 6 miles of the corridor. And so our work was really around strategy, vision, community planning, trying to get a basis for where the city, county, and community wanted to go with this project. Here is some project context. So you'll see we divided the corridor into 3 different pieces to try to kind of understand and plan differently and organize our thoughts. And you'll see that the red boundary is the CRA boundary. We did a lot of community engagement. So these are the different types of engagement that we completed for this initial planning process. And I will say, so the climate gentrification piece of this was a component of, a broader corridor planning study. So a lot of our engagement was around kind of in corridor improvements. What do people want to see? And we did bring the climate gentrification piece to the public as well. Understandably, that was kind of well, that's in the future type of thing. So there wasn't tons of feedback on that topic. Understandably, folks want to make sure that their streets are safe, they can take transit to work, and that they are happy and comfortable in their community. So one quick bit of background on the demographics. So you'll see from these 2 maps that are depicting current demographics today. So on the eastern part of the corridor is just the point that I want to kind of call to, and I'll come back to that with the analysis, is that there is a majority Black and African American population, and there's also lower annual median income compared to the rest of the corridor. I'm sorry, these maps are so small. So why did we think about climate gentrification in this piece or this work, aside from the fact that we know it's happening in Florida? So this map shows you Jackson Street in relation to the larger region. It also shows you elevation. So you can see that elevation compared to some of these storm surge maps, that the Jackson Street corridor sits at a relatively higher elevation to the rest of the region, making it potentially, vulnerable or a desirable place for people to move to now or into the future. So we wanted to consider that at least a high level in this planning process to make sure it were considered. And so the objectives of the gentrification analysis were really supposed to be high level. This is a preliminary assessment. This is a master planning process, initially trying to get ideas around what it means, where the risk could be, and really to inform the longer term vision for this corridor and the region. Since thinking that we're working with the county, it's an opportunity for them to think about how they're planning for climate change. And also, I think one of the key considerations is how do you make sure that vulnerable populations in light of climate change aren't being moved to higher risk areas? So here's a kind of overview methodology of how we approach this. I think it's pretty standard in terms of kind of thinking about gentrification. So you'll see we have climate change as one of those drivers. We also considered the redevelopment and reinvestment pressures that could come with this project or are currently existing. That could lead to voluntary relocation to less risky locations. This could disrupt property valuation. This in turn could then put on financial stress and potentially to displacement and character change of the community. So I'm not going to get into all the details of the analysis, but I think a few key pieces to think about are there's really no prescribed methodology for this currently in practice. There are a lot of great folks in academia thinking about this. We definitely leaned on some of that to kind of build our methodology. Also, we only had publicly available data, so we didn't generate any new data sets to do this analysis, and I think in the future that'd be really helpful. So we thought there were a few different categories and risk factors and trends to try to understand if gentrification were a concern on the corridor, and if it were, where. So we considered climate risk. One component of this was obviously sea level rise and storm surge, but also thinking about shade availability is a key consideration. We thought about social vulnerability, so that's thinking about race, income, zero vehicle households, economic vulnerability, income, and poverty levels. And then also thinking a little bit about the policy piece. Are we working in a context where there's a really high eviction rate and folks are easily displaced and moved out of housing? And then we also did some analysis on market trends, which was also paired with a real estate analysis. So we thought about some of these risk factors and then also kind of screen for the key trends to identify gentrification. So those were really around median value, gross rent as a percent of income, and on the demographic piece, thinking about minority populations, shift in median income, and shift in poverty. So these are the key findings of our analysis. So I introduced this earlier in the presentation that the eastern part of the corridor was already showing kind of different trends in terms of income and race. And so we'd seen through our analysis that the higher risk area for gentrification and displacement is this eastern area of the corridor where rents are going up, incomes are going up, and the percentage of minority residents is going down. So again, this is a really high level analysis. We can't necessarily conclude that it is, the forces of climate gentrification or gentrification itself that are causing these trends. I mean, it could be natural demographic changes. It could be due to the fact that new renters who are moving in are simply paying more, but folks who've lived there for, years aren't. But it could be the fact that there are new, wealthier, non-minority residents moving in, and this could be a concern for displacement. And that climate change could be an exacerbating risk for this existing trend. So what did we recommend in this initial study? So we tried to really kind of think outside what is the traditional box of transit planning. So a lot of times we think about kind of how do we improve engineering design? How do we, make things more resilient or more approachable for users? But we turned to housing. So we made clear recommendations around kind of encouraging the jurisdictions to promote and identify different housing assistance programs that could help folks maintain affordable housing. Some of these are national programs that are relevant in this jurisdiction. We also recommended that the jurisdictions develop partnerships to work with faith-based organizations, nonprofits that would help them identify housing as well. And then I think the kind of key piece of that too is that we literally identified specific units on the corridor that could be bought and transformed into affordable housing. And then on the piece of kind of cultural change, we recommended creating cultural acknowledgements and also just simply investing in art spaces, community spaces, and historic preservation. So kind of in reflecting I will say that these are my reflections when I made this presentation a few weeks ago. I have a lot of thoughts after this conference about kind of what this means more broadly in my work and kind of the work we do as transit planners. But just some food for thought about kind of how we use planning as a tool and we think of investments. I think there's definitely a need to think about, you know, if climate displacement and migration are relevant in your community, how can that be woven into the different types of work that you're doing that maybe aren't necessarily labeled as climate? So in this case, transportation. I think that infrastructure planning and investments have a really critical role to play in receiving communities. So maybe it's incentivizing, maybe it's just preparing for the fact that certain places might be more desirable. How do we make sure that infrastructure can sustain that changing population and also make sure that the folks who already live there are not placed out? And I think kind of, going back to a little bit of Mary's presentation about, these direct and indirect impacts and also those cascading consequences of climate change planning. So making sure that's considered in how we approach this work, that it's not just about a roadway being overtopped by flooding and the transportation field, but it means a lot more for a community. I think that practice and approaches can really benefit from a dynamic, human-centered and interdisciplinary approach. If I were to go and do this project again and continue to work in this space, I would definitely want even more folks from the housing space to be involved and be creative and think about different methods and approaches that we can think about in terms of making sure that a community stayed, accessible for folks who already live there. I also think that there's a really big role for community-based organizations to play in this space. On this project, like I mentioned, it was a really small component of the work that we did. And we did community engagement, but I think in order to actually know what the community would want to see in their community is going through trusted partners and getting that feedback. And I guess I'll just say that while I have definitely learned a lot at this conference, there's still so much work to do in this space and kind of improve the ways we're working on this in our own kind of specific kind of areas of expertise. So I hope everyone learned something this week and learned something new to kind of bring with them forward. Thanks.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Steve Kohler. I'm an environmental science and policy PhD candidate down at the University of Miami. I'm very sorry I'm not there with you in New York today and this week. I would really love to be, but I'm actually in the Netherlands right now, participating in an NSF-funded program for PhD students focused on water management. So still thinking about the issues from over here. Today, I'll be talking about some of my dissertation research, specifically a project called Outracing the Flood, National Estimates of Vehicle Flood Exposure and Damages in the United States. The photo we're looking at here is a salvage yard full of flood-damaged vehicles outside of Houston, Texas, following Hurricane Harvey. And also, I promise I don't actually have 28 slides that I'll be showing today. There are a bunch in an appendix. So in the US, vehicles are a ubiquitous asset. According to the federal government, there are about 275 million registered highway-ready motor vehicles on the road today. That number has grown dramatically in recent decades, and even in per capita terms, the number of vehicles has grown more than doubling since 1960. According to the US Census Bureau, vehicles are the most commonly owned non-financial asset in the country, with about 85% of households owning at least one vehicle, and even among households in the bottom 20% by income, 64% of households own at least one vehicle. Further, a similar percentage, 85%, of US workers commute to their place of employment via a private vehicle. So these are important assets. And I'm sure it's no surprise to the folks at this conference that there's a wide literature and degree of attention in policy and business communities focused on the impacts of flooding to real estate. And this makes complete sense given the fact that real estate and residential property represents a large share of US household wealth, as well as the US economy at large. However, in this work, I argue that vehicles, while a smaller share of the pie overall, are still an important asset type that warrants study in the context of flood damage. This plot here is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and it shows the relationship between floodwater depths and damage to vehicles based on vehicle type. We can see that at about 2 feet or so of flooding, we would anticipate somewhere between 20 and 30% of damage to a vehicle, depending on the type. Then, as we get up into that 5 to 6 foot range of floodwater, we might expect to see a total loss from many vehicles, with larger vehicles being slightly more resilient, but only marginally so. So a single flood event could cause a lot of damage to a vehicle. And flood damage to a vehicle might more adversely impact some households than others. This plot that we're looking at here shows vehicle assets as a share of total household asset wealth. The data are from the US Survey of Consumer Finances from 2019. And we can see on the left-hand side, that large green bar, the largest bar, that's the average household in the bottom 25% of households in the US by net worth. So that average household in that net worth group has about $8,300 worth of vehicle assets. And those vehicle assets represent nearly 1/4 of the value of total household assets. So vehicles are really an important share of this household's asset portfolio. Now, as we move along the x-axis and look at that smallest green bar, which corresponds to the average household in the top 10% of households by net worth, we can see that the average household in that group has about $57,000 worth of vehicle assets. But those vehicle assets represent not even 1% of total household assets. So for households towards that lower end of the net worth distribution, on average, we would expect a vehicle flood damage event to be potentially much more of a financial shock in relative terms. Now, this might not actually be a big shock if the household has insurance coverage and can get a payout from their insurer for those. However, not everyone has insurance coverage. Vehicles are not covered by FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. It's an entirely separate private market. And comprehensive auto insurance policies are the type of policy that typically include coverage against flood damage. This is typically an optional policy that covers multiple perils, and it's not legally required in any US state. According to the Insurance Information Institute and Industry Association, approximately 32% of drivers on the road in the US do not have comprehensive coverage, so are not covered against flood damage to their vehicle. So, as I showed a moment ago, a single flood event could cause a lot of damage to a vehicle, and for some households, a single flood event impacting their vehicle asset could represent a big financial shock. And if those damages are uninsured, it could be a large net loss to the household's assets. So with this motivation in mind, I'm asking a number of research questions in this project. First, I ask how many vehicles are located in US floodplains and what is their value? This is a fairly basic and descriptive set of questions, but important as a foundation for future research and policy design. Second, I ask what are aggregate vehicle flood damages in the US? Again, like the first set of questions, this one is not represented in the academic literature or in policy discussions as far as I've seen. And throughout, I'm asking what policy opportunities might exist to improve flood resilience for vehicle owners with particular attention towards those most financially vulnerable vehicle owners. I'm going to zoom ahead to the results for the sake of time, and I would be more than happy to discuss my data and methods with you offline. Comments are very welcome. But in short, I use a number of federal agency data sources and a asymmetric mapping technique to estimate the numbers on this slide. So according to data in 2020, I estimate there are approximately 13 million household vehicles in FEMA special flood hazard areas. So areas, according to FEMA, with at least a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. That number bumps up to nearly 20 million vehicles when considering the 0.2% annual exceedance probability of flood zone. So it's important to note here that, of course, FEMA's maps are not perfect and don't capture the full spectrum of risk and flood probabilities. So that's one reason these numbers may very well be significant underestimates. Additionally, when considering that 32% of motorists being uninsured against flood damages, that implies that there are perhaps millions of vehicles in floodplains across the US for which there is no flood insurance coverage. When using a recent Kelly Blue Book value for the average used car sale price in the US, these numbers indicate that there are approximately $300 billion worth of vehicle assets in FEMA special flood hazard areas and over $460 billion in the 500-year flood zone. So that $300 billion figure is roughly in the ballpark of the annual GDP of the state of Connecticut, so a sizable number. And additionally, I use a slightly different approach with Army Corps data instead of the asymmetric mapping technique. And in that approach, I actually reach fairly similar estimates, which is reassuring from a validity and an accuracy standpoint. This map here shows where vehicles in the floodplain are in the US based on my estimates. It, I'm sure, comes as a huge to you to see that Florida is number one with about 2.6 million vehicles in special flood hazard areas. Texas and California also have a large number of vehicles in their special flood hazard areas. And then when using my most conservative assumptions for the value of vehicles, I estimate that there are still about $67 billion worth of vehicle assets in FEMA special flood hazard areas in Florida, with, again, California, Texas, also Louisiana, New York, sticking out as in the top states. It's also worth noting that when considering these numbers for the 500-year floodplain, Arizona also emerges as a state with lots of vehicles in that floodplain. Now, moving on to that second research question, what are aggregate vehicle flood damages in the US? I'll caveat by saying this is a very difficult question to answer, in large part due to data gaps. Unlike for structures and the contents of structures, vehicles are not covered by the National Flood Insurance Program, like I said, which also means there's not a publicly available administrative data set on insurance claims. When I've reached out to the largest auto insurers in the country, State Farm, Allstate, Progressive, Geico, none have been willing to share data with me on this topic. So an area for future research, but for now, the best I could do was get data from FEMA's Individuals and Households program via a Freedom of Information Act request on the number of applications they received following presidentially declared disasters, which reported vehicle flood damage, as well as the awards that FEMA gave out for applications with vehicle flood damage. So according to the data that FEMA was able to share with me, between 2007 and 2022, there were over 160 applications for disaster assistance in connection with vehicle flood damage cases. And of those applications, about $132 million in disaster assistance was awarded for those vehicle flood damages. It's worth noting that among the data I've looked at, there are more than 70% of applications coming from households making less than $30,000 per year gross. And even among awardees, the number of applicants receiving any disaster assistance for vehicle flood damages is greater than 70% in terms of the share below $30,000 per year. The median award for successful applicants here is about $5,000, with some disasters such as Sandy being higher at $10,000. And here I'm just noting that, well, FEMA's Individuals and Households program has over 20 million applications available in the full data set. They were only able to share a bit over 1 million observations with any information of vehicle flood damage. So this could be an internal documentation gap at FEMA when setting up a call with their data team to learn more about this. For the sake of time, I won't go into all of the policy implications of this work so far, but one I will highlight is the fact that flood risk disclosure laws have been found to provide some consumer protection and benefits in the residential property buying context, and perhaps flood risk disclosure laws might also be applicable and viable in a vehicle purchasing context for those in flood-prone areas. So going forward, I'll be refining these estimates based on state-level data and corresponding depth damage functions based on vehicle type. I'll also be conducting this analysis at the census tract level, which I already have done, but incorporating the CDC's social vulnerability index to see where vehicles are located relative to communities' vulnerability. And at the moment, I have a survey ongoing where I'm eliciting willingness to pay for specific auto insurance policies and how much warning time a vehicle owner might need before a flood event to move their vehicle and avoid flood damage. So getting some interesting results with that. Please stay tuned. In sum, I believe I'm making a novel contribution here by estimating that there are many, many vehicles, an estimated 13 million in US floodplains, worth over 300 billion when considering a 100-year floodplain. FEMA has paid out over $100 million in disaster assistance in connection with vehicle flood damages. This is certainly just a drop in the bucket in the share of total vehicle flood damages, and more work needs to be done to get data from FEMA at the very least, given they're a public agency, and also work with insurance companies to learn more about this issue of vehicle flood damage. We can also begin to consider policy alternatives that might improve flood resilience to vehicle owners, particularly those who are most financially vulnerable. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And I'm sorry I'm not there. I hope you're having a great time up at Columbia, and please feel free to reach out by email here or on the app. I would love to hear your thoughts or chat or your constructive feedback.
Well, we are over.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I'm just not your questions.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.